All right, we're going to continue with our series here on World War I. This particular video is about the note page entitled Europe Plunges into War. So where we last left off, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by a member of the Black Hand. It sounds so like spy novelish, but that happened and that catapulted European nations because of the alliances that they had formed into World War I. Remember, that was one of the main causes of World War I was alliances. All right, let's look at some of the details of World War One. Okay. All right, so the World War One starts off by having as the old alliances and then adding to them a little bit. So you had the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente were essentially the two sides in World War One, but eventually they changed a little bit. The Central Power, and they also all changed their names. So the Triple Alliance became known as the Central Powers, and you had Germany, you had Austria was the same. So we can write that in for our definition of Central Powers. That was the side in World War I that had Germany, Austria, Hungary, and then our question number one here, they were also joined by Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire. So we can answer two questions, the definition and question one with that information. All right, on the other side, you had essentially the same nations. You had Britain, France, and Russia, and they became known as the Allies in World War I. So Allies consisted of Britain, France, and Russia. In addition to that, there were some other countries that joined. You can see the Allied flags represented here. So Japan, as ironic as that might sound if you know about World War II, joined the war on the side of the Allies. That was the sides, so to speak, at the beginning of World War I. But this was literally a world war, so most countries in the world were on one side or the other, particularly countries that were colonies of European nations joined the war on the side of the nation that they were a colony of. All right, when this war first started out, remember the map of Germany here, we can look at it here. Germany was fighting a war on two fronts. They had Russia on this side, they had France on this side, they had an enemy on either side. So they had to come up with a strategy to be able to win a war where they're fighting two different enemies at the exact same time. So what they came up with was, oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back real quick before I get ahead of that German plan. There was one nation that I forgot to mention. They were part of the Triple Alliance before the war started, but once the war started, they felt like Germany and Austria had unjustly started the war. That's the public reason they gave. The less than public reason was they were hoping to gain a lot of territories by joining a different side, and so Italy switched sides. So Italy was a member of the Allies once the war broke out as well, even though they used to be aligned with Germany and Austria-Hungary. All right, getting back to my point, Germany how do you fight a war with two enemies, one on either side? So they came up with this plan. It was called the Schlieffen Plan, which is a great German word to be able to say. And since we're not in class and you're by yourself, you can go ahead and say it without worrying about not sounding cool. The Schlieffen Plan was come up. This was named after a general. And even though Schlieffen is not a verb, I'm going to continue to use it as one for the course of this particular lecture and maybe others. All right, this plan was, in order to deal with this two-front war, is to go and attack France so quickly that it was just an overwhelming, really quick victory. They were the greater opponent, and then to reroute their troops and go back and attack Russia before they could mobilize themselves because they were a little technologically behind most European nations. So it's a quick attack on France and then get your soldiers at the other side of Germany so you can attack and defend against Russia. And this was the Schlieffen Plan. All right, the little picture here, this is how Germany planned to Schlief France. They planned to go, as I mentioned, they planned to go through Belgium, even though they shared a border. This was a kind of a fortified border, so instead of going through here, they went through Belgium, which was a neutral country. Belgium is neutral in every war. They're way too concerned with their chocolate and their waffles to get involved in something like a global conflict. So they ignored that. They weren't fighting. They went through Belgium, and the goal was to attack France. But you remember what I said is once they attacked Belgium, Britain got involved because Belgium and Britain had a treaty. All right, so in order for, as far as our questions here, in order for the Schlieffen Plan to be successful, France had to be defeated quickly so that they could reorganize their troops to defend against Russia. All right, there's some information here on this page we're going to look at, a couple different battles here. All right, the German advance into France was stopped right here at this location called the Marne, which is a river that was located near. That's why it was named the Marne. So the French were able to halt the German advance and sort of, I guess, unschlief the Schlieffen Plan. So that stopped this from being successful. It really forced the Germans to have to fight a two-front war. And that was kind of, there's a couple other battles here. You don't have to memorize battles in World War One. That's not going to serve any purpose. But there's the Marne, there's Verdun. These are all battles that are from World War One. You don't have to know any battles going forward. All right, so this is a picture of the conflict. I should go back for a second. Forgive me. They stopped the German advance, but the Germans got to a point where they couldn't go anymore, and then the French got to a point where they couldn't push the Germans back anymore. So usually in a war, one side takes territory and you try to keep taking territory, but in this war, neither side could really gain any territory, so they just dug down, metaphorically and literally as well. So that's what this picture shows. They literally dug down in these trenches, and that's how the majority of the fighting was. You know, they couldn't advance on the enemy very far. They couldn't push these lines, so they just dug in. And there's some interesting features here in this. You see this sort of like maze of trenches that they connected together, and this is where a lot of troops stayed. You can see a couple troops were completely underground. A lot of times they spent time in these trenches, and this was just a horrible, horrible experience because these troops were sitting in these trenches. You see all these divots in the ground here? That's because artillery shells were being shot, and you heard that whistling sound of an artillery going through the air and then exploding on the ground. So there's this constant fear of, is it going to land in our trench? Is it going to hit us? But you're always hearing bombs go off constantly, and the whistling of them being shot through the air. You got a barbed wire guarding your trenches, as in case any of the enemies decide to jump out of their trenches and run at you, because that was pretty much the sophistication of these attacks. This was basically dug into the ground, so it was muddy and it was dirty, and it was just not a good situation for these soldiers to be in. Just not only was it damaging to the body, but it was damaging to the mind as well. I used to have this article that I would show until it was taken off the internet. It was a diary from a World War One soldier. He's so desensitized to the violence that he was hanging his canteen on like an arm that was sticking out of the trench because they just saw so much carnage that wasn't shocking to them anymore. Another thing to mention here is that if we were to flip this around the other way and put it over here, that's what the other side would be looking like. And then the space in between those two trenches had a special name here. It was called No Man's Land. It kind of looks like the setting of an apocalyptic type movie, if you can think to one of those you might have ever seen. So it was just no vegetation, maybe tree fragments, just these divots in the ground with rainwater filling them up. And it was very depressing sort of area, literally called No Man's Land. All right, another term here is this type of fighting is called trench warfare. So for our vocab terms, this sort of fighting in this style that happened when World War One was known as trench warfare. So this is where they lived, and then occasionally they'd run out. It's called going over the top. They'd run out of these trenches and charge the enemy, and that really didn't usually do much. All right, so I'm going slightly out of order here. So the Western Front, as it was called, the line where the Germans and the French and some British dug in and just kind of trenched each other back and forth. That doesn't sound right, but they did that. It was about 500 miles of trenches that through Belgium and between France and Germany, where this sort of fighting existed on the Western Front. All right, some of these issues that soldiers faced. It's a bit unpleasant. All right, they play. You can see the layout of this. It's pretty makeshift, and imagine if it gets wet. A lot of these soldiers were sitting in water, or their feet were in water a lot, and that led to some pretty gruesome diseases. But there was mud everywhere. This goes without saying. Other thing is you've got supplies thrown everywhere. You've got some bodies, and so this was just a rat-infested hellhole. I mean, that's literally what it was. Also, difficult to sleep. It's hard to sleep when there's this constant threat of a mortar going off, like right where you're sitting. So it was difficult. They weren't they were sleep deprived. There's just filth everywhere. There's death everywhere. There's decay everywhere. People getting hurt in horribly vicious ways. And and this is just life for trench people in trenches. I want to show you a couple of images that are. I'm going to prepare you ahead of time. They are quite shocking. They could be worse, to show you the sort of infirmities that happened to people as they were sitting, these soldiers as they were sitting in trenches. All right, so here's some. This is called trench foot. These are all people's feet as they sat in these decaying situations in this mud, and it had took a toll on their feet. These are, and I will tell you right now, these are tame pictures of what happened, the infections that some soldiers got on their feet from sitting in these trenches. This other one, it's a famous picture here of this guy who had a wound from, you can see this facial wound that he had as a result of probably a bomb going off near his face. It says this is shocking and hard to look at, but it's not nearly as shocking as the side view of what happened to him. So again, prepare yourself a little bit. You can imagine such a devastating injury happening to a human being and them still living. This is what happened to this particular guy, and this is not normal, but this is the sort of thing that happened in this environment. All right, this is a quote. This is actually a Civil War general, but it makes sense in World War I. It says, "It is only those who have neither fired a shot nor heard the shrieks and groans of the wounded who cry aloud for blood, for vengeance, for desolation. War is hell." And that's from William Tecumseh Sherman. So he's essentially saying that only naive people wish for war or think it's glorious in some way, because those who have been in it know that it's awful. All right, at the outset of this war, Russia had some advantages. It certainly wasn't technology, but they just have a lot of soldiers. And sometimes that was the strategy, if you can imagine that. It wasn't be more a better planner than the enemy. It was keep throwing guys at the enemy until they can't stop it anymore. And just imagine what it would be like to be a soldier if that's what your leader's philosophy was. Another thing that was difficult for the Russians is they didn't have a rail network as sophisticated as other European countries, so it was hard to get their troops the things that they needed. I saw this exaggerated movie once, not 100% accurate, exaggerated for entertainment purposes, but it gets the point across that this is, uh, in a sense, what Russian soldiers dealt with. In this movie, a bunch of soldiers were being taken to the battlefield, and they could hear the mortars going off and things like that. And then when the train doors opened, they all ran out of the train, and there was individuals there with trucks that were handing out supplies as they were running into the battle. The only thing is they didn't have enough for everybody. So one soldier would get a gun, one soldier would get a clip of bullets, some soldiers would get nothing, but everybody ran into the battle. And then the generals were standing behind everybody in case somebody turned around, they'd shoot them for being a traitor. So it wasn't quite that bad, but Russians were way behind, and their troops definitely didn't have the things they needed. Sometimes they didn't have shoes, sometimes they didn't have food, sometimes they didn't have warm clothes, and so Russian soldiers just suffered way more than other people in this war because of their inept government.